Hello and welcome to this Adobe Lightroom landscape editing class. I'll be taking you through the important steps of photo editing specifically for editing landscapes. First, just a little background on who I am. My main work is as a producer, which does afford me the opportunities to travel, and when I'm going to amazing locations, I always like to make sure that my camera travels safely with me as well, so I can snap shots like these. Over the course of this video, I'll be taking you through how I work with landscapes, the tools I use within Lightroom, and the adjustments that I make to produce something that I'm happy with and something that I'm proud to share with others. We'll firstly look at the editing steps for colour images. Then we'll take a look at how we can convert that colour image into a good contrasty black and white image. In terms of my setup, for those of you who may be interested, I'm working on a custom-built PC using two different monitors. One is an ultra-wide monitor and the other is a colour-accurate BenQ monitor, with the BenQ being my main one, so I'll be screen recording from there only. As for my travel media, I do travel a lot, so I find the LaCie rugged drives seem to be pretty robust and fast enough for any work that I do with stills. In this video, I'm also running the latest version of Lightroom Classic, which at this time is Classic 9.2, so let's get started. At this point, you should have your first image imported, open, and you should be in the develop module, so it should look something like this. If you're using my image, then please do follow along with my work. I'll make sure to keep at an easy pace. And if you're using your own image, then you should be able to follow along too, as the guidance that I'm going to give will work across any landscape image. The image I've selected for this video is a really good one to utilize a lot of the tools within Lightroom, so we can really explore the possibilities of what can be done to an image that isn't perfectly captured in camera. Something I like to do when editing is to give myself the maximum amount of space available on the screen. This is especially important if you're working on smaller screens, such as laptops. So one thing that we can do here is to increase the size of the screen is just to get rid of things like the film strip and the bar at the side here, and these little arrows will do that, so just clicking those just means that these disappear out of the screen and maximizes the size of our actual image itself, so we can get rid of the top one as well. We've got plenty of grey space around the sides, so there's no worries in terms of the image being shrunk any more than it needs to. Also, the bar at the side, the right hand bar, the edit bar, this is something I like to maximize, so we have a little double arrow here that we can pull out and just make sure it's as large as it can possibly be. So you can see the slider size changes quite drastically depending on the size of the bar. So the larger the sliders, the more accurate we can be with our adjustments. So when you first take a look at the image, you should really pick up on a few things that really need to be addressed. First of all, you'll notice that the colour balance is quite off, it's quite blue. So this was shot late evening, and during the day I would have shot using a custom white balance, as I was using a few filters. You'll also notice that there are some light trails in the back as well. These are a little distracting, so this is a longer exposure, so that's why these are there. There's a few lights towards the right where the helicopter is as well. There's a little light at the top of the helicopter, a little orange glow on the blade there, and overall it's not a particularly great exposure. It's relatively balanced, but it's all quite dark. I do have a relatively set way in which I address an edit and how my workflow is in Lightroom. I work so that I have my tabs in solo mode. So to do this, all you can do is right click on the tab itself, just make sure that solo mode tick box is checked. Working in solo mode just means that I'm quite clear in what I'm working on. There's no clutter or additional tabs open that I don't need, so I can really just concentrate and hone in on those edits on that tab. And as I click through, it closes the previous tab, the tab before. It just gives me a nice, clear and easy view of exactly what I'm doing. And as for my workflow within Lightroom, I tend to work from top to bottom, so I start off with the basic tool and work all the way through the various different tabs as we go through, and then I'll look at the crop and all the way to the adjustment brush tools at the top at the very end. This is how I work. Other people may work differently, so just find a way and a method that works for you. Before I get started with any edits and any adjustments though, one thing I do like to do is just open this lens corrections tab. So that's just the tab here. So just click on that and we have a couple of checkboxes that need to be ticked. So this is the enable profile corrections checkbox. So tick that one, and the remove chromatic aberration checkbox. So just tick that as well. You'll notice when we enabled the first one that there's a few little changes that have been made to the actual image themselves. So we had some vignetting which was in the top left and top right corner, with possibly a little bit of creeping in of something like a filter holder as well. We also had some vignetting in the bottom. We've got this little bit of the car which I was using to rest my camera on at the bottom here. So by enabling this correction, it's actually got rid of a lot of the unwanted nasties that were in this image, and it's just straightened out the image as well, so it's got rid of any barrel distortion. And not that you'll see it on this image, but it does reduce any chromatic aberration. Now in terms of the camera lens profile settings that we have here, you can do this manually as well. So if there's not the EXIF data on the actual camera itself or through the file, then you can do the selection manually. So this is for the lens, so you can select the make of the lens, the actual type of lens that it is, as well as the focal length. And this is lastly the profile that Adobe has created for that lens. So that's the first adjustment done, and one of the quickest and easiest ways of just correcting those little nasties that may be brought on through the lens or the camera itself. So we can just move on up to the Basics tab, which is at the top. So as I said before, this image is a little bluer than what it should have been. The white balance would have been incorrectly set on this, just through me wanting to quickly snap this shot. So we'll move over to the temperature bar just here. The little slider that we've got here, you'll see that it's blue down on the left hand side and yellow at the right. So the warmer it goes up to the right hand side. So we're going to want to warm this image up a little bit just to get to somewhere that we're happy with in terms of the color temperature. Now there are two ways of actually getting the color temperature correct. One, we can do it manually with this slider, which we'll do now. So you're going to want to bring the slider up to a point where you think that the color temperature looks about right. So it's about here, the clouds are white enough, there's enough kind of warmth within the grass and within the mountain face here as well. So that's the first way of correcting the color balance. You'll also notice that the white on the helicopter is a bit purer as well. It's not so much of the blue tinge that we had before. We can undo that quite quickly and easily. So if you do make any changes to a slider and you want to undo those, just double click on the word on the name. So we've clicked there, so it's just set that slider back to where it was. The other way that we can do is by using this little color dropper here. So we select this, we know that the helicopter front should be white, so what we want to do is just make sure that is our white source. So get the color dropper, we select an area that's quite nice and white, and we just click, and it makes very similar adjustments, and it's put a little bit in the tint as well. So I'm happy with either of these. As we've selected this one last, we'll stick with this color temperature and we'll move on to the next lot of sliders. After we've balanced the color, we're going to focus on the exposure of the shot. Now with most landscapes, one thing you'll come across is that you'll almost always have a variation in exposure levels between the sky and the ground. Obviously things like physical graduated filters will help with this, and I'd always recommend using a physical filter over hoping to fix it in post. But even if you do use filters like this, like I did here, you still may need to do some extra work in terms of balancing out that exposure. So to start off, I want to get one element of the scene as exposed or well exposed as possible. So for this image, as the sky is probably the easiest one to work with, I'm going to actually work on the exposure for the mountain and the foreground here. So we're going to concentrate on this. We'll ignore partially the sky, and we can deal with any changes that we need to do to this at a little later date. So the first slide that we're going to look at here is the exposure one. So what we want to do is just bring this up so we get a bit more detail within the foreground and within the tree line here. We do have plenty of detail and information in the clouds up here, so I have no worries with any changes that we're going to do to this, that this is going to bleach this out or we're going to lose any information. Also, this image was shot in RAW, so we do retain all of that lovely information that we need to make a really good edit. So we'll start off by just adjusting this exposure slider. So we'll go up to a point that I'm quite happy with the exposure in the foreground here. So what I really want to do is just concentrate on this tree line and just make sure there is some definition in here, just to make sure we're not losing that, so it's not just a big mess of block black that we have in this whole tree line. After changing the exposure, one thing you'll notice is that the contrast does drop quite considerably. So we can use the next slider, the contrast slider, just to bring that back a little bit. I only use this ever so slightly, as there are a few tools here that I'll use just to emphasize that contrast a little bit more. So let's just bring this up to a level that doesn't lose that detail in the tree line, but brings in some contrast on the mountain face here. The next 4 sliders, well, they're quite important ones for working with a lot of images. In terms of people's workflows, you'll normally find that a lot of photographers will concentrate on these. These are quite easy to adjust, and then make some small adjustments using the tone curve, or they'll do it the other way around where they are concentrating on the tone curve and then make some small adjustments with these 4 sliders. So going down the 4 sliders, we have the highlights one as our first one. Now this lightens or darkens the lighter areas of your image. So as we just play around with the slider, you can see specifically in the sky that the sky becomes lighter or darker. So this is what we're actually affecting during this image. So what we want to do is just reel that highlights in just a little bit, so we are not losing too much detail in these kind of clouds here, but they're not too bright, so we're not losing the actual nice detail within the clouds themselves. The shadow slider is pretty much the opposite, so it controls the lightness or darkness of the shadow or darker areas of your image. So again, we can play with this, so we could really lift the exposure for this tree line here, but then that brings it into a shot where it looks like it's shot during the day instead of during the evening. So we want to just rein that back a little bit. Let's have just a little bit of the shadows lifted here, just so again we maintain that detail in the important areas of the image. The white slider, this controls how white or how bright the actual white areas are. So again, playing around with this sliders, you'll notice that we have some quite bright whites that come in. And that red that creeped in the top there, well, if you hit the J key on your keyboard, that's a little shortcut for you. This will show you the areas of the image that you're losing the detail in due to clipping. So you'll see on the histogram here that this is the white area is actually past the top of the histogram. So we're actually losing detail here. So you want to make sure that you're not getting any of these red spots in your image. So we'll just dial this back a little bit until we get a good, nice part of the image that doesn't have any of these red spots in. And then the same with the blacks slider. So again, it's just how black the shadow or darker areas are. So as we go all the way down, you'll see some blue encroaching. Now this is the opposite of the red. So we're actually losing the information here due to how dark that area is. So it'd just be a solid black if you were to print it, which isn't going to have any definition in at all. So we're losing that information there. So let's bring this up to a level that we're quite happy with. Just darken those darker areas up a little bit. We've got a nice good exposure for this foreground and for the tree line here as well. We're not losing too much information along this whole line. Generally, in terms of slider adjustments, especially for these main 4 here and the following lot in the presence tab, I tend to go plus or minus about 30 points. I seem to find that that gives a more true representation of the image itself. And when you go a little bit above or below that, you will normally find that the image starts to look a little over-processed. It's not a hard and fast rule that I stick to though. Sometimes I do drift outside that depending on the image and depending on what I need from it. Next up in the Basics tab is the Presence section. Now the sliders that I use here, the main one and one of my favorite sliders is the Clarity slider. Now this was introduced relatively recently in Lightroom's history, and it's a really good way of sharpening up the image itself. So if we just have a quick look here on this mountain face as we go with this Clarity tool, we'll just slide this up a little bit and you'll start to see a bit more definition coming into that mountain face. So again, we're just going to go about the 30 points here. We get some nice definition on this rock face. The other slider that we might want to use, again, it's a relatively recent one with Lightroom, is the texture tool. So as we start to bring this up, you do start to see, again, that rock face on that mountain just really start to have a bit more detail and definition. And then the third one in this bunch is the dehaze tool. So again, you can use this to lighten the image and it just kind of flattens out the contrast a little bit, or you can dial up the contrast here and it does seem to get rid of a little bit of the wispiness in these clouds, just giving a more defined, more contrasty image. The next 2 sliders alter the actual color of the image. So this is the vibrancy and saturation tool. Now in terms of bringing in a bit more color using the actual colors that are there, I prefer to use the vibrance tool over the saturation tool. The reason for this is that the vibrancy slider tends to be a bit more accurate to its real representation from the actual image itself. I find the saturation one just has too much color, too much pop in it. So for a landscape scene like this, I just find that it just overdoes it a little bit too much. So we're going to use the vibrancy tool for this one. Just bring that up. You'll notice a little bit more color come through, especially in this little scrubland here and on the red on the helicopter. The next tab down is the tone curve. We should only need to make some very minimal adjustments here in this color edit, as we've got the exposure pretty much there for the main part. A lot of editors, as I said, will prioritize either the tone curve tool here or the main 4 sliders in the basics one, and we'll do minimal adjustments on the one opposite. So how we use the tone curve is we open up the tool first of all, and you'll notice that we have something that represents our histogram in the background. It's very similar to the one at the top here, just a little bit more condensed or compressed. We also have this grid section at the back and this line running from bottom left to top right. So this line is our adjustment line. So what we want to do is set some anchor points on here, and we can do that just by clicking on either part of this bar. And you can set pretty much as many anchor points as you wish, depends on how in depth and how skilled you are with the tone curve tool. I tend to use the cross sections on these horizontal and vertical lines just to get me started. So I'm going to pop one just here and one just here. So this is the lower area, this is the darker area of the image, and these are the highlights up here. So we've got this double arrow here as well, so it shows us that we can move this around. Now we don't just need to go up and down, that's not our only option. We can also just move the anchor point up and down the line. So as I said, we're going to make some very, very minor adjustments. I just want to lift the darker areas ever so slightly, which I can do here. And then let's just bring down the highlights ever so slightly there as well. So the tone curve is a slight, very, very slight S shape that we've got here. If you want to experiment, then do set some anchor points. Do stick to those grid lines just to start off with, they do help. Or alternatively, Lightroom have a couple of presets that are built in, either a medium or a strong contrast, so do have a look at those. And if there's a tone curve that you use on a regular basis that you've custom made, then you can just hit the save button and it will save it to this little list here. So that's the tone curve. It's a really useful tool, so do get to know it and do get to use it in a lot of your images. As I said, you can make very, very minor adjustments here if we've looked at the basic one. Kind of made our main adjustments there with the actual contrast of the highlights and the darker areas of the image. Moving on to HSL or color. HSL is hue, saturation and luminance, so we have 2 ways of using the same tool pretty much. So we can go via the color one, so we can pick our initial color. We have the hue, saturation and luminance, that's on the color tab here, or we can switch across, or we can individually change the color settings for luminance, saturation and hue across the entire color range. I prefer to use the color one so I can just concentrate on the color itself and do all the adjustments that I need. So one thing I want to do is just make a small adjustment to the red on this. So I've selected the red one here. I just find that it might be a little bit too bright. So I'm just going to drop the luminance ever so slightly. You should see that red darken up a little bit. Let's just drop the saturation so it isn't so much of a distracting part of the image. This tool is really useful. I find a lot of wildlife or bird photographers use this, especially if you are shooting on things like reserves or on wildlife trust land. You might find that in the background you have a very annoying bright yellow or bright red sign in the background. So just by using this tool, you can actually just reduce that color in there so it's not such a distracting element in the image. The next tab is split toning. This is quite a nice one for this image. So we have a couple of options in terms of what we can do with split toning. Now you don't have to use both of them. A lot of photographers and a lot of filmmakers will do split toning in terms of using the highlights to get a color in the highlights and a specific color in the shadow area or the darker areas as well. But for this image, I really just want to put in a little bit of color in this sky here. So when we come to edit it a little bit later, we actually have a nice pleasing sky color. And this was late evening, so this is something that we can do and something that we can introduce. So this is the actual hue, the color that we're going to introduce to the sky or the highlight areas. So I want a nice slightly purpley sky, and then this is the saturation, how much it's affected. So as we bring this in, you start to see that kind of quite nice evening purpley sky that you get on a nice evening. So we've just introduced that little bit of color to the image itself. Now you could use the warming kind of tone here. So you could be on the kind of reds or orange and just dial that in so you get a bit more warmth in the image. It depends on this sort of look that you're going for, but we're going to stick with this purpley color, but do feel free to go down whatever color route you want to. So we've introduced that color in the highlights. Now you can, as I said, introduce the color into the shadow area as well. And I'd make sure you're using something that is a sympathetic color. So you can go online and there are a few websites that you can look at that will give you the sympathetic color to the one you've originally chosen. So just kind of give you almost an opposite color just to drop into that shadow area. So that's split toning looked at. The next section is detail. Now this is for sharpening the image. Now I've already done what I class as kind of sharpening using the clarity tool, and I prefer to do it that way over using the detail tool here. The main reason that I don't really like using the detail tool is because it does introduce a lot of noise. There is a noise reduction section just within this tool, but I find that mushes up the image ever so slightly as well. So you're actually undoing the work you're doing with the sharpening. But if you do want to use the sharpening tool, then I'd recommend just first of all looking at this little window up here. You can access it with this little drop down. So you have this little window here which is of the image that you're working on, and this little crosshair in the top left corner of that box. So just click the crosshair. Let's find a part of the image that we focused on, which would be this helicopter. Let's find a nice section of it so we can check the sharpness. So let's go there, and then you've got a good zoomed in part of the image that you can focus on. If you're doing things like portraits, then I would use this to crosshair on the eyes, so you can actually see how the sharpening is affecting the eyes, and while seeing the entire image in the main screen as well. With sharpening, even though it is a raw image, the camera would have applied some sharpening to it anyway, so you have a small amount of sharpening that's already been dealt in with the EXIF data. So really, apart from the stuff that's already been put in by the camera, I personally wouldn't want to sharpen this image anymore. But you can go ahead and have a play around with these sliders just to see what they do. If you are shooting with higher ISOs and you do find that it's bringing in noise, especially in the shadow or dark areas, then do use the noise reduction tool that's here. So dial this in ever so slightly just to make sure you are alleviating the presence of that noise, but whilst keeping the sharpness of the image overall. So that's the detail tool. We're going to move on to the next one. As I said, we've looked at lens correction, that's already been done. Transform, we'll have a quick look through this. This isn't something that we want to use within this image, as I don't find that anything is distorted in any way, shape or form than what we would expect to see in this image. But if you are shooting things like architecture photography and you want to eliminate or alleviate those converging verticals, then this really is the tool for you. So you can just use these various different sliders just to adjust the ups and downs of your image, just get that more perfect image across. The next slider is the effect slider. Now it's not something we're going to look at during this edit, but we will look at this slider during the black and white phase of this video. So we'll leave this one for now. We'll come back to this a little bit later, and calibration isn't something that I look at all for this image at the moment. Now, if you want to have a quick look through over the edits that you've done and the different tools and what they do, then you have these little light switches here so we can really see what we've done with each slider and each addition to the image. So that is the main use for all of the sliders, to get the edited image that we're after. We're now going to jump into the main tools that are just at the top. Now there are a few ones that we're going to use for this image, but one thing I just want to say before we head on to that is if you do find that you're editing a lot and you want to kind of speed up your workflow, then I would look at something like the loop deck. I have one of these. This is the loop deck CT. I'm not using it for this edit. I'm sticking with the traditional mouse and keyboard just to stick along with you guys, but I do find that this actually speeds up my workflow quite a bit. So if you are editing a lot, I'd recommend picking up either the CT, which does quite a few different bits of software, or you can pick up the Loop Deck Plus as well. So yeah, that's the main use for all of these sliders down the right hand side. Now we're going to move up to this section just at the top. So we're going to start off with the crop overlay tool. One thing I will say is with the various tabs, don't feel like that once you're done with the adjustments in that tab that you can't go back and refine them. This is almost a small juggling act with each tab. So if an area isn't working for you, then go back and adjust it with the relevant tab. So back to the crop tool. We have a few options here of what we can do. First of all, we have these little tabs which are around the side. So we have one on each of the straight edges and one on each of the corners. Now we can make the adjustment to the image as a whole. We have the padlock which is locked here, so any adjustments we'll do will stick to the original aspect ratio that the image was shot in. So if I grab this tab here and move it across, you'll notice that the whole image stays at that aspect ratio and we get a crop of the same kind of size. So what I want to do with the crop is actually just to eliminate that tree just down the right hand side, just to move it in. So I'm just going to grab this side slider, just move it in a little bit. If you find that you've moved it in and you've lost a bit of the image that you didn't want to lose, then you can just move the image itself around. So you've got the little hand icon here, so that appears anywhere within these 9 squares. So you just click to grab the actual image itself and you can move the image around. So we want to get rid of that tree, just keep it in the bottom left hand corner there and let go, and that's our crop. To save this, you can hit the enter key or you can hit the little done button, which is just down the bottom here as well. So you're just going to click that and that's our crop. So we're back into the main develop module. I will just show you a few other options that you have in terms of what you can do with the crop overlay tool. So we just click back onto there. So we've got our crop here, it's non-destructive, so we still have our original image just behind here, so we can bring this arrow back out and get the full image if we want to. We can do as many crops as we wish, and it'll never detract from the main image. You'll still have that main image to revert back to if you need to. As well as cropping, we have the option of straightening the image as well, and there are a couple of ways of doing this. So first of all, you have this little double arrow, this little curved one here, and once you've cropped the image, this will appear just outside of the crop area. So you can click with your mouse, which brings up this additional grids, and then you can just rotate the image itself. And you can use those grid lines just to really straighten up the image, just to make sure it's as straight as possible. Once that's done, just let go, and that is the image corrected in terms of its angle, and you'll see the degree of angle that it's changed here. The second way is by using these tools here, so you can either use the slider just to get the adjustment, and when you click that it will bring up that grid box that we just saw. So we can rotate the image and again get it to where we wanted it with the grid. Or you can use the little spirit level tool here, so just click here, click on one part of the horizon, drag all the way across and you get the straight line, and then let go, and that just makes the adjustment for the horizon. As well as doing adjustments for the horizon, you can also change the aspect ratio of the image. So if you wanted to change this from a landscape shot to a portrait orientation shot, you can click on this and just drag in a different crop angle. So here we could have a straight up angle here, just straight onto the mountain if that's what we wish to do. Just going back by pressing Ctrl Z or Command Z on Mac, we have our image cropped back to where it was. The other option that we can do is actually change the size of the crop as well. So we have it as the original, this is how the image was shot, but we can actually look at a few different examples here. So 10:8 being a very popular print size. You also have some sizes for screen resolutions as well. And if you have a custom size one and there is a custom size print, for example, or something custom on your website, then you can enter a custom size here and then you can crop to that size. And with the aspect ratio locked, that will stick to that size itself. If you want to experiment with some of the actual crops as well, and you want to do it manually, if you just untick that box so the padlock is unlocked, you can just change the actual crop size of the image as well. So that's the crop tool. We have our crop all finished and we have that tree that's been removed from the right hand side. Now we could have removed that using the spot removal tool, but it's a bit more of a job than what I'd want to do for this image, and also these clouds have a little bit of detail in them and I just don't want to have to replicate that with something like the spot removal tool. So talking about the spot removal tool, this is going to be the next tool that we look at for this image. Now, as we said at the start, we have these little areas down here, and they've actually come out a bit more as we've been editing. We have this little glow on the top of this helicopter blade here, and we have these light trails in the back left of the image. So we'll deal with those first. So let's zoom in so we get a really nice view of those light trails. And these are something I want to get rid of because they are a little bit distracting. I want that more natural look for this background as well. So we'll click on the spot removal tool and you'll see we have our brush size here. So it's a couple of circles. Let's make that a little larger so you can see that. We have two circles here. The center circle is the main affected area, and then the distance or the gap between the inner circle and outer circle is the bleed off or the feather. So you can change the size with this little slider as well, and what we want to do is just pop that over the light trails just at the back there, and just make it ever so slightly bigger. Now I'm using the center scroll wheel up and down to change the size of this, so if you have one of those you should be able to do that as well. In terms of the feather, I want a slight bleed off, which is about just a little bit bigger than the brush itself. And then the opacity, I want that to be at 100%. That way we're not getting any of the light trails from behind bleeding through the adjustment that we're making. So we'll go over to this first light trail, and what you want to do is click, hold and drag across the image to this first tree. When you let go, Lightroom will do a lot of the hard work in terms of trying to match this area with a nice source which is picked out from this area. So this is again the tree line, so it actually is quite a good area for this to pull from. If you do find that it's pulled from the wrong area, maybe it's sampled something up in the mountain range or in the grass area here, then you can grab the pimple from this and you can kind of move it around to the area that you want to. So we could pull in a different section here, and as you can see, as we move it around, it makes some slight adjustments and changes to the area that we're covering that had the light trail on originally. You just let go and it will reference to there. So that's the first one done. We can move to the second and third one. So I'll do these in stages. I prefer to do small amounts at a time, as then it means there's less for it to need to reference from, so it'll do a more accurate job of covering up that area. So the first time round we did a click and drag, and that was a little bit of a wobbly line. So for this one, as it's a straight line, what we can do here is to hit the shift key, click with our mouse and drag across, and that'll give us a nice perfectly straight line. And again, it's referenced from over here. I don't really have any issues with that, other than it's probably a little bit too high there. So I'm just going to bring that down just so it matches the ground level and the tree line there. And once that's done, I can then move on to the third and final one. Again, shift, click and drag for that nice straight line. I'll do that there, and it's just referenced from there. So let's have a quick look at those and just to make sure that we're happy with those. Okay, so those three adjustments look really good. We'll just zoom out to our full image, and again, if you have a look at these from this point, you can see that they aren't really noticeable that we've made any changes there at all. So it's got rid of those little light streaks, so that tidies up the image, just makes the whole thing look a lot nicer. Moving over to these lights on the right hand side, there are a few things that we can do here. One thing I will say is that we'll go through these relatively quickly. I would recommend going through something like this a little bit slower than what we're going to do here, but now that you know the tool and understand it, we can go through this relatively quickly. So what I'm going to do is pick out individual spots. The first one I'm going to do is just this little glow on the rotor blade here. So we'll just select that bit, and that will reference from there, but actually I want to just reference from there so it covers it up with some tree line. Let's go over this section. We've made the tool a little bigger. That's just referencing from there, which is fine. Again, just a little bigger to cover this dot. Let's drag this from up here. Let's get this one done from here. And let's just see if we can drag this one out and how that works. Okay, that's not too bad a job. As I said, I would recommend spending a bit more time on doing something like this so you can be a little bit more accurate. Now you'll notice here that as our J key is activated, which is to show the highlights and dark areas that are clipped, we've got some of this blue speckles coming through. So these are areas of the image that we are losing. So this is a good point that we can go back to maybe the basics tool, and we can just raise those blacks. And you'll see as we raise that, it starts to get rid of the little speckles there. A handful of them is absolutely fine. I don't mind that at all, especially in this area as it is quite dark. So let's just click off the there, and yeah, that's absolutely fine. So just raising those blacks for the basics tool has really kind of got rid of those speckles, and it's not done too much damage to the actual main image itself. So that's the main use for the spot removal tool, and that's how I use it within this image. The next tool is the red eye reduction, and obviously during this image this isn't applicable at all, so we'll move on to the next adjustments. Now there are 3 more brushes left in our set up here, or 3 more tools left in our set up here. The first one is the graduated filter, we then have the radial filter, and we then have the adjustment brush. Now we're not going to do the radial filter as this isn't really a tool that I'd use for this landscape, so we'll just go straight into the graduated filter, and this is much of the same of the type of filter that you put on the front of your lens to even out the exposure in the first place. So we'll just open this tool up, and what you'll see first of all is that a lot of the sliders that we had from the basics tab from earlier on, they are then brought into this tab here to work with our graduated filter. To activate this filter, just click on an area. I normally click at the top, which is the area that I want to change, and drag down to bring on the affected area. Now I want to make sure that I include the lighter area to the left of the image as well, and I might want to just do a slight angle just to change the how this effect is going to come into this image. Once you're happy with how the effect looks, then just let go and we can start making some changes to the tool itself. So when I set up the tool, before I even click, sometimes I will always make sure that I drop the exposure down just to make sure that what I'm doing I can see on the image itself. Have the contrast up by default as well, and the color, temperature and the tint is set to 0, so it has no effect on the image when I'm making the changes. Things that I'll want to do here as well is just to change the highlights. So I want to actually just bring up the highlights ever slightly. I want to make a bit more contrast within this image just to really make a nice punchy sky, just to match this quite moody foreground and mountain range. If we bring up the whites too much, we do find that red peaks in, so let's just flatten that out actually a little bit. So we'll drop that down, maybe we'll even drop the highlights down a little bit just to bring in that mood. And then with the blacks we can really bring these down a bit as well, just to bring in that dark moody sky. One thing you probably have noticed is that the blue is clipping in on these trees here, and we're also darkening up the top of this mountain range, probably more than what we want to do in the first place. So one thing that we can do to alleviate that is just by going down to this range mask, which is again a relatively new tool within the Lightroom software. So just click on this little arrow, we'll go to luminance to start off with. We have this range mask here, so this bottom arrow, what I want to do is just bring that up. As you bring that up, the blue disappears from this tree here, because it is affecting everything other than the dark areas. Just to show what it's working with, we can just click this show luminance mask. So this was actually going to show us the area that it's affecting. So as we bring this up, we start to see that it's affecting less and less of the top of that mountain. And we untick that and it returns the mountain back to normal, and we still have the nice contrasty look on the sky itself. So this is now an image that I'd be very, very happy with. I would normally spend a bit more time on each of the sliders, making some more final adjustments. I may even use something like the adjustment brush to bring in a bit more contrast itself on the mountain face. But in terms of a relatively quick edit, this is a good example and good finished product. We've looked at the graduated filter here in terms of bringing the sky back, and there is another way that we can do this, which I prefer and I find is a bit more accurate, and that is with the adjustment brush that I mentioned just a moment ago. So we'll just bring the graduated filter back on. We have the little pimple here, so we just want to get rid of that. So just select it and hit the delete key, and that disappears. We can then move over to the adjustment brush, and again we have the same sliders as we did previously and from the basics tool. So again, make sure that the temperature is set to 0, tint is set to 0. We drop the exposure a little bit, have some contrast in there so we can really see what we're doing. With the brush itself, you notice that the brush is actually quite large. We have quite a bit of sky that we need to cover in, so I do like using a large brush. So the size is there. We have the feather, which is a decent size, so when we brush in near the mountain, that we can make sure that there's some adjustment going over a little bit. We still get that background sky in as well. And the flow, I like to keep it about 30% around that kind of area. That way I can brush in different areas more or less, depending on how strong I want the effect to come through. Now, so that we're not covering too much of this top of the tree line here on this mountain, you could use something like the auto mask, but I normally find that you get this 1 or 2 pixel outline as it doesn't quite do it perfectly. So I don't tend to use it for busier horizons or busier skylines like this. So we'll go ahead and we'll start brushing this in. The exposure is down a little bit. I might just drop that down a bit more just so we get more of an effect. We can start brushing this in. So I'll do a single pass over with just 1 click. So I'm pressing and holding. So this is one entire press and hold that I've gone through. Brush in around this area, just to kind of cover everything in a good way. So we have this all brushed in. What I want to do is actually just work on this area up here, as this is a little bit lighter than what I'd want it to be. So I've done the initial brush, so I'm just going to click again and brush over just this area and let go, and click again, brush over this area and click once more. And you'll notice that that's really darkened up this part of the sky and brought it up to a very even exposure with the rest of it. We'll just brush in around here a little bit as well, and we'll just try and bring some detail and some information back from there. You see, as we brush, we did shoot in RAW, so it's got that information from the clouds. We are bringing that detail back in that back left section as well. If you want to see the area that you have covered with your brush, then there's this little checkbox which is just down there. That shows that we've done a pretty good job of covering. Let's just cover these bits up here as well, and just over this section. So you can be quite haphazard with this, and you can see that we have covered some of the mountain here as well. So one thing we can do is just go back to this range mask, which is available for this tool as well. Drop down to luminance. We have this little slider here. Let's just uncheck this one. And we'll just tick in this show luminance mask box here. Again, we'll just bring up this slider so we can start to reduce the effect that it has on the darker areas of the image, just so we can show the effect on the main part of the image that we want to affect, which is the sky in this case. We'll just untick that box, and you can see that the mountain range again is very unaffected, and we have the sky as our main affected area, bringing that nice kind of contrasty start to our shot. We can then go ahead, now that we've brushed out the areas that we want to change, and make the changes using these sliders. So that's some quick adjustments that we've done to the sliders just to bring in that really contrasty sky and to get it to match the feel and the tone of the foreground and the mountain here as well. So this is why I kind of prefer using the adjustment brush tool, because you can be a little bit more accurate in terms of the areas that you're covering. You can also dial in a bit more of the effect into the areas that you want, and to leave off the areas that you don't want it to affect so much. So in terms of editing for colour, that's the main steps that you'd go through. As I've said a few times, just make sure you go through it methodically, just to cover off all of those sliders and just to get the best out of that image. You can go through it a lot slower than what we've gone through it today, but that gives you the good basis to edit from. Now we're going to look at how we create a black and white version of this and the steps we go to make it really nice and contrasty and bring in that almost filmic look. So we have our main image here. This is what we've edited. So what we want to do is actually probably create a virtual copy of this. So you have the film strip, which is at the bottom here. So let's just bring that up permanently for the time being. If you right click and you go to create a virtual copy, this will create a copy of that image. You'll see another one should appear next to that image. Okay, so this is our virtual copy. So you can see this is our original. This is something I worked on before. This is the first copy. This is one we've worked on just now. And then we're on this one, which is 3 of 3. This is our new virtual copy. So let's just get rid of that film strip so we can work on this together. Now, the reason I've copied this, not gone from scratch, is because we've made quite a few local adjustments to the image that I want to keep in here. So when we go and edit this, let's just close down the adjustment brush. We'll go back to the basics tab, and you can see that in the treatment, we have 2 options, color and black and white. And this is the way to get it from color to black and white. So we brought this in and already it's quite a contrasty looking image. It looks really quite good and something that I'm pretty much happy with so far. But there are a few adjustments that you might want to do in terms of making the black and white really stand out and be a bit more filmic. So in terms of the 4 sliders that we've looked at here, what I actually quite like to do in terms of editing for black and white is just to reset these back to 0, because I prefer to use the tone curve to get the most out of my black and white. So we're just going to go back to the linear one here, which is just how it started. We'll put in our anchor points. I'm going to put in 3 anchor points this time. I really want to make a nice contrasty black and white. So I'm going to actually bring the darks down here. We're going to lose some of that detail in on the darker areas here. Let's bring in some nice contrast and get a good looking S curve in there. What I can do is I can bring this down just to darken up the real dark areas, chuck in an additional little point here just to lift up these mids. And it's starting to look really nice and contrasty. So really kind of darken those blacks up. So this is where we go back to the basics tab and we just bring these up ever so slightly just to lift the detail here and to keep that kind of contrasty look. We can also brighten up the whites itself, ever so slightly lift the shadows and drop the highlights ever so slightly. So we have this really nice contrasty look. This white fluffy cloud in front of the mountain looks great and is a really good start to our image. Okay, so let's move down to one of the other tools that I like to use when I'm working with black and white as well. So this is the Effects tab. I did mention it a little bit earlier and it wasn't something that I was going to address at the time, so now it's a good time to come back to it. Now we have the vignetting. We've already done the crop for this. Vignette isn't something I'm going to bring in on any landscape that I do really, so we'll leave that for now. But if you are shooting something like portraits, then the vignette is a good way to just hone that focus into that main subject. The tool that I'm going to use within the effects though is the grain selection here. So just going to bring this grain up. Let's zoom into here so we can see the effect happen. Just going to bring this grain up. As you bring it up, you'll see we do start to get that speckle in. That's not something we want really at this point, but I'm just showing you a more extreme version of how that grain looks. Let's bring it to a point just before those blue specks start to show, which is about there. Let's increase the size ever slightly and the roughness looks quite good at 50. This just brings in that kind of filmic, that film kind of grain look to the image. It gives the image a bit more texture as well. And talking of texture, let's just go up to the texture slider, just make sure that that's at the right position as well, because that brings in a nice bit of detail into especially the rock face within this image. So you can see we've got that contrast there. So all in all, this is the start of a really nice looking black and white and something that should print up pretty well, something that should look good online as well. We have plenty of detail in the tree line and that's been kept with the adjustments we've made. We've got this grain coming through in the sky as well. Whether this is something that you'd like out of your image, then do make the decision yourself. The helicopter itself is again standing out really quite nicely, so we've made some good adjustments to make sure that that stays quite prevalent within the shot. Now one thing you've probably noticed on the sliders is that our HSL and color tab has changed to B and W, so black and white. So this is the black and white mix. And you can see that as we make some adjustments to the changes, the red is a really good one to look at because the tail of this helicopter is red. You can actually lighten that up if you wish to, or darken that up, depending on what you want to do, depending if you want to lift it from the scene itself. We can also look at bringing on a bit more definition within the grass area here and just lightening that up just with the yellow and green, because these are the tones that were in there originally. Maybe even the orange will help lift that up a little bit as well. And do have a play around with the sliders just to see what effects you can get in terms of bringing the image on to a shot that you're happy with. So in terms of creating a good black and white, those are the main sliders and tools that I would look at for your edit. Now, if you were to start from scratch, then I would go through pretty much exactly the same tools that we went through for the color one, but just do that black and white switch right at the beginning. You can then work through the image quite methodically to make sure you're ticking all those boxes and bringing out a really good contrasty black and white image. So we're just going to go back to the adjustment brush here just to make sure that our changes for the sky are exactly how we want them. Now, all the sliders here are quite neutral, so they've gone all down the middle. That just means that we haven't got our pimple selected. So we just got to this little dot here, click on it, and you can see our sliders are exactly where we'd want them to be. Just make a couple of minor adjustments just to the sky, just to kind of really bring that detail and exposure to where we want it to be. And that's the final changes and adjustments to our image. So thanks for watching. I really do hope that you got a lot out of this Lightroom session. Do let me know if you have any questions about what I've covered in today's session, and I'll make sure that your questions are answered. Also, if you do any changes like this to any of your other images, do make sure you share them with us. Thanks for watching.